book. Just a quick review from last time. Remember, Esther has a banquet for Haman and the king. If you haven't been with us, Haman is Satan's agent who has written a law that on the 13th day of the 12th month, every Jew in the Persian Empire will be killed. Imagine that. A law in the strongest empire on earth at the time, the Persian Empire, that on the 13th day of the 12th month, every Jew is to be killed. You think, oh, Satan's got it beat. He's got God whipped here. There's no way out of this. We're going to see how God gets out of this. Very easy for God. This is no problem. So Esther is a Jew. Cousin Mordecai that we'll see in the story is a Jew. So Esther has a banquet for Haman, the bad guy, and the king. Only 3 people. We saw that last time. Esther asks that they come back tomorrow for another banquet. King Ahasuerus asks her, Esther, queen, what is it that you'd like? Ask me anything, and up to half of the kingdom I'll give it to you. And she says, what I want is for us to come back tomorrow and do this again. And it's on this night, the night between the baskets, that God changes human history. On a simple night, Haman goes home from this event, this first banquet, and he brags about how honored he is in the kingdom of King Ahasuerus. We saw that in verse 7, where he goes back and he tells his family and his friends and his wife how honored he is. He shows off the glory of his riches. He shows off his family and his sons. And then he says, but I hate Mordecai the Jew. And every time I see the face of that Mordecai the Jew, all my happiness goes away. So his wife and his friends say, what you need to do is build a gallows 50 cubits high, which is about 75 feet, which is extreme. It would have been twice as tall, if not more, taller than anything in the kingdom. But that's what they say to him. Build a gallows, a very, very high gallows, and impale Mordecai on it in the morning. And once Mordecai is dead, you can go to the second banquet, the banquet with Queen Esther and with the king, and enjoy yourself after having committed murder. Can you imagine these things? So Haman goes home and brags. He tells how much he hates Mordecai the Jew. Haman is told by his family and his wife, build a gallows, and so that's what he does. Haman builds a 75-foot tall gallows on which to impale Mordecai. Remember, we're not talking about a gallows that we think about, the Wild West, and hanging someone from a noose. That's not what this is. This is an impaling stick. This is something that tapers to the top where a human being is driven down onto it. That's how they killed people in the Persian Empire. They weren't hanging people in the Persian Empire as we know it. So this gallows was an impaling. On that very night, this is where God, he's been in the entire story, but this is where God steps into the story in an incredible kind of way. On that very night, the night between the first banquet and the second banquet, when Esther says, what I want is for you to come back tomorrow. She doesn't know why she's saying it. She doesn't know that the king's not going to be able to sleep that night. For whatever reason, Esther said, I want to reconvene tomorrow, and I'll state my business tomorrow. And on the night between those two banquets, the king cannot sleep. And God causes this. And what does God do in the period in which the king cannot sleep in the middle of the night? The king asks for the history books to be brought to him. Now imagine this, the Persian Empire with all the history that's been written down, all the chronicles of the king, and the person that comes in brings the book that has the story of Mordecai the Jew having saved the king's life a couple of years earlier. And if that's not God's hand in the story, then it is. No sarcasm. That is God's hand in the story. God makes the king unable to sleep. The king calls for the history books. And in the books, as the king is laying on his bed and someone is reading to them, the thing that God has read is how a few years earlier Mordecai the Jew saved the king's life. Of all things to read, that's what comes into the room that night that the king can't sleep. Don't tell me God's not in this story. King Ahasuerus decides to honor Mordecai. After he hears the story, he says, what has been done for this man? Remember at the end of, I think it was chapter 3, when this event occurred, there was an oversight on the king's part. Mordecai saved his life. The king knew that it was Mordecai, that the information that Esther gave him had come from her cousin Mordecai. But the king doesn't do anything for Mordecai at that time. We start the next chapter, and all of a sudden this man Haman shows up on the scene, and the king elevates him to a position second in authority in all of the Persian Empire. Nothing was done for Mordecai. And you say, why would that happen? Why would the king overlook Mordecai saving his life? It was because God was going to bring the story back up on this night. That's why it happened. So King Ahasuerus on this night decides that Mordecai the Jew needs to be honored. We've got Haman at his house thinking, bragging about how honored he is in the kingdom, and in the palace where the king can't sleep, the king has decided to honor Mordecai. So what do we see? Mordecai the Jew is led through the city by Haman. I can't retell the story. You have to go back and read it. But Haman, in a way that only God can do it, God changes, he turns the story upside down on Haman and Satan. And Haman is horribly humiliated by having to lead Mordecai, a man he hates, a man whose people, the Jew, he has written into law that they will all be killed on the 13th day of the 12th month. All of a sudden, Haman finds himself walking through the streets of Susa, honoring Mordecai on horseback. That's how that story ended. Mordecai the Jew is honored by the king and led through the city by Haman. And after that event, Haman goes back to his house in mourning. M-O-U-R, not in the mourning, but he is mourning. He realizes things are very askew. Things are off. And Haman's family and his friends tell him that he will fall to Mordecai the Jew, whom the king is honoring. They tell him, if Mordecai is a Jew, if he is of Jewish background, then you will not defeat Mordecai. He will cause you to fall. And that's what we're about to see. Look at what Esther 6:14 says. Just one verse, and we keep going into Esther chapter 7. Esther chapter 6, verse 14. While they were still talking with him, this is his family and his friends and his wife. While they're telling him, Mordecai, it's all over for you. Imagine that. You're done. Haman, it's all over for you because Mordecai the Jew will defeat you. It's already begun. You drug him around the city today. While they are still talking to him at his house, the king's eunuchs arrived and hastily brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. All of a sudden, it's showtime. It's time for the banquet. The king sends eunuchs to go get Haman, who's having a very, very hard day. Esther chapter 7, this is the second banquet. This is the next day. Haman has built the gallows 75 feet tall. Haman expected to kill Mordecai on those gallows. Instead, when he gets to the palace, the king says, no, you're going to honor Mordecai today. This is that day. Now the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther the queen. And the king said to Esther on the second day also, as they drank their wine at the banquet, this is the king's question to Esther, the third time he's asked it, what is your petition, Queen Esther? What can I do for you? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to half of the kingdom, it shall be done. So her husband, the king, is telling her, honey, whatever you ask of me, I am going to give you today. You just name it, and it's yours. Interesting. Queen Esther replied. Remember what happened the night before. Remember what the king knows about Mordecai now and the Jews. And Queen Esther says, if I have found favor in your sight. She's throwing these words back at her husband, the king, because earlier he said those things to her. You have found favor in my sight. Ask what you will and I'll deliver it to you. So she uses his words, gives them back to him. You could say, since I have found favor in your sight, you're the one, husband, who told me I was favored. So because I'm favored in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, because you told me earlier that I pleased you, let my life be given as my petition. What do I want from you, king? I want not to die. She's asking the king to save her life. And the king doesn't understand where this question comes from. She says, let my life be given as my petition and my people as my request. Esther's asking to be freed from a death penalty that this Haman has written into Persian law. The 13th day of the 12th month, every Jew is to be killed, destroyed, and annihilated. That's how he wrote the law. So Esther's requesting that her people, Israel, be saved. What does the king not know about his wife Esther? He doesn't know she's a Jew. He doesn't know she's a Jew. She has hidden her identity as a Jew from the king until right now. This is the first time the king realizes that his favored wife, this beautiful virgin that had been gathered from the kingdom, from the outskirts of Persia somewhere and brought in, that this woman, Esther, is a Jew. He just found out. She says in verse 4, for we have been sold. Not just me, but my people. We have been sold. What does she mean by that? Remember when Haman came to the king? Haman was so mad at Mordecai that he said, I will give the kingdom 10,000 talents of silver. I'll pay the fee that it cost to destroy all of Israel out of the Persian Empire. I want them all gone. Not just Mordecai, every one of his people. I want them all dead. And Haman decided that he would pay 10,000 talents of silver to destroy the Jews. He would personally cover the cost. Esther knows that. So Esther says, we have been sold. You sold us for a price. She's got to be careful because this is her husband and this is the king. And she certainly doesn't want to implicate that he's at fault. It's Haman's fault, not the king's fault. What's the truth? Whose fault is it? Both of theirs. Without question. Remember, the king gave Haman his signet ring and said, you do whatever, the money is yours, and do whatever you please with the people. So ultimately the authority is the problem. King Ahasuerus. But Haman is clearly Satan's man on the ground here. So she says, we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed and to be killed and to be annihilated. She uses the words that went out in that petition, that law that Haman wrote with the king's signet ring. She uses the same wording so the king could start to understand what she was talking about. And then she makes a very interesting statement. Look what she says here. Now, if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent, for the trouble would not be commensurate with the annoyance to the king. So she shows a great humility for her people Israel. What she's saying is that if Haman would have bought the Jews at the price of 10,000 talents of silver, if he'd have bought us and made us slaves, I wouldn't be here today. Maybe Israel deserves to be slaves. After all, God kicked them out of the land of Canaan over the last 70 years, didn't He? So she says it wouldn't be a great disservice to Israel. I would not have annoyed you. I wouldn't have come into your presence if all it was is that we were sold as slaves. But we weren't sold as slaves. He didn't buy us into slavery. He paid a price, at least offered to pay a price, to kill us, to annihilate us from the planet. That's why it was worthy of me coming to bother you, king. So, King Ahasuerus here for the first time learns that his wife is not Persian, she is Jewish. And so he's stunned by this, he had no idea. Verse 5 says, then a King Ahasuerus asked Queen Esther, who is he? Knowing that this had to have come from a spearhead, someone is in charge of doing something like this, having sold Israel into their death. Who is he? Not who are they, who is he? He wants a name. Who is he and where is he who would presume to do thus? This man loves his wife. Doesn't have a whole big heart for the Jews, but he loves the queen that's in front of him. She finds favor with him. He's pleased by his wife. He loves her. And if she's been sentenced to death, he wants to know who in this kingdom presumed to destroy my wife. And so we see in the story that Queen Esther, remember at the table there are only 3 people. That's how Esther has called the banquet, Esther and the king and Haman. And Esther says of Haman in verse 6, a foe and an enemy is this wicked Haman. A couple of words, I didn't write them down here, but the word for foe is tsar, T-S-A-R, like the Tsars in Russia. It means someone who offers opposition. Someone who offers opposition. The word for enemy is oyev, and it means a personal enemy. Listen to what she's calling Haman, and through Haman, the accusations against Satan, who's clearly behind the annihilation of the Jews here. He's someone who offers opposition. What does the word Satan mean? Accuser. Someone offering opposition to God's people, the accuser against God's people. He's also an oyev, a personal enemy of the Jews. It's personal. Personal enemy of the Jews. And she also calls him wicked, the Hebrew word ra, R-A, ra, which means morally bad or wrong. It also means evil. So she has just pointed out this man Haman, who the king thinks up until this moment is a great guy. Who is second in command in the Persian Empire? Haman is. The king has no idea who Haman is at this point. The king's just as shocked by this as he was shocked to find out that his lovely bride was a Jew, and he'd never known it. So Haman, it says, then Haman became terrified before the queen or the king and the queen. Oh, I bet he did. I bet that he did. What did his family just tell him a few hours ago? If Mordecai is of Jewish descent, you will fall to Mordecai. And here it is. Esther having pointed out Haman as the one trying to kill the Jews. How does the king respond? Look what it says in verse 7. The king arose in his anger. We see throughout this story, this King Xerxes, Ahasuerus, is King Xerxes of Persia, more popularly known as Xerxes in the history books. He was a man of great authority, but he was also foolish. He picked a fight with Greece that he couldn't win and that he didn't win. Greece, who finally ended the Persian Empire, destroyed the Persian Empire. That was this man's fault. He's a hasty man. He doesn't use his authority properly. He makes bad decisions, and we've seen it throughout the book of Esther. So here I think the king is probably upset that he had no idea who Haman was, second in command in the Persian Empire. So the king arises, it says he arose in his anger from drinking wine, and he went into the palace garden. The biggest part of the story is the king left the banquet. Who's left in the room? 2 people. When I was a youth pastor for 10 years, part of the rules of youth pastoring is if anybody's ever in the room with you, you either have someone else in the room with you, you make sure everybody in the church knows you're in that room with that person, and if all you can do is leave the door open, you leave that door wide open. Because perception becomes reality. The pastor's in there with the teenager, a teenage girl. Doesn't look good, does it? So the king leaves the room, and we have Esther and Haman left in the room. What an irony we see here in verse 7. Look what it says in the second half of the verse. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther. The wicked man, Haman, who used his authority to write a law to kill all the Jews, all of a sudden is begging for his life from who? Not only a Jew, but a Jewish what? woman. You can't get any lower. You can't, I'm talking about from Haman's position as an authority in the Persian Empire, these fleas, these Jews that he wants killed, all of a sudden he finds himself at the feet of a woman that wouldn't have been in a position like this. The way the Persians would have eaten is much like Jesus ate at the Last Supper. They would have been reclined. They would have been lying down on their elbows at a table. That's the way they would have done this. So she's a lying down woman, and all of a sudden he comes to her to beg for his life. And so the positioning of these things would be questionable when the king walked back in the room, as we'll see him do in just a minute. She would have been reclining, and Haman would have come to beg. Maybe he put his hands on her feet, trying to get her attention, begging, pleading for his life from this Jewish woman. But when the king returned in verse 8, it did not look good. When the king returned from the palace garden into the place where they were drinking wine, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. Again, perception often becomes reality. It doesn't matter what's really happening, but what looks like happening, well, that's the story that's going to print, right? So what the king saw, at best, was this man Haman way too close to my wife. Way too close to my wife. What he didn't know is that Haman was pleading for his life. That's what he was doing, but he doesn't know that, and his perception becomes reality. And what does he say? The king says, "Will he even assault the queen with me in the house?" Not only is this evil, wicked man one that would have all the Jews killed, the man who had and I'm talking about Mordecai now, Haman would have all the Jews killed because Mordecai the Jew was an honorable enough man to have the king's life spared. So the king loves the Jews all of a sudden. The king doesn't want the Jews dead. As a matter of fact, he honored the Jew. He chose a Jewess for his wife. He didn't know it. It was all undercover. But all of a sudden, he sees Haman in an entirely different light. When he comes back into the room, he agrees he's an evil man. And not only that, but under my own nose in my own house, he assaults my wife. Now, you got to look at this word, kabash, K-A-B-A-S-H, kabash. And you might think assault in the physical sense, like hitting someone, like she was under some sort of physical danger from him. But what kabash means is to molest or sexually assault. So what the king saw this man trying to do with his wife, number one, he just learned that this man wants his wife killed, and his wife comes to him pleading for her life. And now you want to sexually assault my wife? Not today. Right? Not today. The word went out. It says, even as the words were being spoken by the king, there were authorities there, and they covered Haman's face. They understood the gravity of what the king was saying and what was taking place between Haman and Esther. And it's like the Secret Service in the White House. They immediately fell down on Haman and covered his face. That's the way that they would have gained control of Haman, by covering his face, disorienting him so that they could control him better. In verse 9 it says, Harbonah, one of the eunuchs who were before the king. Look at how God turns the story on it. Just turns Satan's plan and just flips it upside down without almost no effort. It's just not hard for God to do this. Harbonah, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, Behold, indeed, the gallows standing at Haman's house 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on behalf of the king. And the king said, Hang him on it. Haman's wife and Haman's family the evening before said, build a gallows 50 cubits high, kill Mordecai in the morning, and then you can go to the banquet and enjoy yourself. You won't have to look at Mordecai when you leave the banquet or look at him when you come into the banquet in the gate of the palace. Do away with Mordecai and enjoy the banquet. And look what's turned out. All of a sudden, these great gallows that he had built to show everybody his authority and that this Jew must die, because remember, Mordecai wouldn't bow to Haman. He wouldn't give Haman special respect when Haman passed by the way everybody else in Persia was. Haman stood straight up. Mordecai stood straight up. They asked him, why aren't you doing it? Why aren't you obeying the king? Why aren't you bowing to Haman? And he said, because I'm a Jew and we don't do that. And now look at who God is honoring in the story. Mordecai is all of a sudden King Ahasuerus's hero. It says, so they hanged him in verse 10. So they hanged Haman on the gallows which he had prepared for Mordecai. Because God always wins. Always. And the king's anger subsided. Isn't that ironic? That Haman wanted the gallows built so that his anger could subside, because every time he saw that Mordecai the Jew, it enraged him. So Haman wants to kill Mordecai so Haman's anger can go down. But it's the king's anger after Haman is killed that needs to be, or that is subsided because of Haman's death. So many ironies in this story. So many ironies. So Haman's dead. Who was Haman again? Stick with me in the story. Haman was Satan's agent. Haman was the man in Persia that had rose to second in authority in all of the kingdom of Persia under King Ahasuerus. Haman is the one who had the idea because he hated Mordecai. I don't just want to kill Mordecai. I want to wipe out everybody that has Mordecai's blood. All the Jews dead. The 13th day of the 12th month, he wrote into Persian law that everybody in Persia was to kill every Jew they saw. Annihilate, kill, and destroy the Jews on the 13th day of the 12th month. The man who wrote the law is now impaled and dead. So here's my question. Are the Jews safe from harm now? Did Esther save the day by calling the banquet, by calling out Haman to the king? Is everything solved now? What's the answer? Yes or no? I got yeses and I got no's. Who's going to be louder? If the answer is no, why is nothing solved? The answer is no. The Jews aren't out of the water now. The only thing that's been done is that this one evil man has been killed, so Satan's leader has been killed. But what's the problem? Why are the Jews still in danger? Because you cannot change a Persian law. Once something is written into Persian law, it cannot be changed. And on the 13th day, say it with me, of the 12th month, all of Israel is to be killed, destroyed, and annihilated. That is still the law in Persia. Haman is hanging on a 75-foot tall pole, dead. But Israel, in a few months, is facing annihilation from the Persians still. It's 474 BC for those of you who like to keep track of dates. I gave you a timeline earlier in the book. It's 474 BC. And in the 12th Jewish month, all the Jews are going to be killed. Now we're going by a Jewish calendar. What's the first Jewish month? It's Aviv. Aviv. And that's in what we would call March or April. This isn't January and December we're talking about. When they mention the first month and the 12th month, we think January and December. These are Jewish months. So the first month is Aviv. The 12th month is the month Adar, A-D-A-R, and it would fall in what we call February. So that's the timing that we're dealing with, and we're in the year 474 BC. We know when Xerxes reigned. In chapter 8 then, let's keep going just a little bit. Remember, the laws of Persia cannot be revoked. So think in your head, what would you do? All of a sudden, Mordecai's the hero in Persia, the Jew. Esther the Jew, a heroine in Persia. But they still have a huge problem on their hands. In a few months, every one of our family, us included, according to Persian law, will be slaughtered in the 12th month on the 13th day. We still have a death sentence over our head. So the story continues. High drama, right? They should make a movie out of this. I mean, a really good one. There are movies of Esther, but boy, you could make this up well. Verse 1 says, on that day, King Ahasuerus gave the house of Haman. Now listen to this. It keeps going. He gave the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther. I mean, when God humiliates, He humiliates completely. Remember what Haman's wife said along with his friends? Build the gallows, kill Mordecai, go enjoy the dinner with the queen. I wonder where the wife is. We don't hear about the wife again, but I know where she's not. Right? She's not in that house she was in when she said, go kill Mordecai the Jew and enjoy your meal. She doesn't live there anymore. All of a sudden that house is given to Queen Esther. And what does Esther do with it? Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. I just love God. I love the way He handles situations in life. I love the way He controls human history and how He chooses to do it. I just, an event like that, I just want to cheer and say, yay, God. How awesome is that? You want to feel sorry for Haman? Don't. Don't do it. Just like you want to feel sorry for all those poor people in the land of Canaan, where God says, go in there and kill everything that breathes. Don't do it. God has made this decree. He's a perfectly fair and just God. Don't forget that when you read these events. He's a perfectly fair and just God. If He says someone has to die, friends, that someone has to die. That's all there is to it. Don't feel badly for what's going on here. Think, oh, poor Haman, poor Haman's wife. Forget that thinking. You don't have to be mad, but be on God's side. This is righteous indignation here. So what does the king do? It says he gave the house to Queen Esther. Mordecai had come before the... I skipped that part. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had disclosed what he was to her. So sometime between Haman being impaled and this particular day that we read about in verse 1 here of chapter 8, Esther has told the king that Mordecai that you honored, he's my cousin. When my parents died, I went in to live with my uncle's son, and that's Mordecai. He's family. And so all of a sudden the king summons Mordecai. He asks Mordecai to come to him. And so Mordecai does. And look what it says in verse 2. The king took off his signet ring. Remember, this is the same ring that he had given Haman a few chapters earlier and given Haman the authority to write a law to kill all the Jews. This is not a wise king. All of a sudden, he pulls off that ring again, the ring that he had given to Haman, it says. The king took off his signet ring, which he had taken away from Haman, and he gave it to Mordecai, and Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. He's an impetuous king. I told you earlier, he picked a fight with the Greeks, and he lost. You don't pick a fight with an empire that's stronger than you, but that's the kind of man that Xerxes historically is known to have been. So not only here we see more irony, not only is Haman hanged on the gallows that he built for Mordecai to be hanged on impaled on, but now Mordecai lives in Haman's house. We'll see in a minute or next week probably that in Esther chapter 10 verse 3, look at this verse. I love the way God has turned Satan's plan upside down, where Satan had seen Haman elevated to second in authority in the kingdom so that he could do this and write this law to annihilate the Jews. All of a sudden, who becomes the second in the land? In Esther 10, we will read the last verse of the book, says, for Mordecai the Jew was second only to King Ahasuerus. Who held that position earlier? Haman did. I love the way God does what He does. You can't make this stuff up. He was great among the Jews and in favor with his many kinsmen, one who sought the good of his people and one who spoke for the welfare of his own nation. His whole nation. Mordecai rose up like another man in the Bible. Who's the other Jew that rose up to second in command in a kingdom that wasn't Israel? Joseph. This is the second time we've read this, that God has blessed someone to rise up to second only to the Pharaoh or to the king of the land. You've got a Jew outside of the land of Canaan who's second only to the king of the Persian Empire. And only God can do that. And people say, well, God's not mentioned in the story. This probably shouldn't be a biblical book because God's not mentioned. And I read a verse like that and say, God's in every word of that verse. Only God can do these things for His people Israel. So Esther spoke again. We'll read another verse and we're going to stop. It's a cliffhanger night. Verse 3 says, then Esther spoke again to the king. Because remember, Israel is still in a horrible predicament. The 13th day of the 12th month is coming. Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet. She wept and she implored him. She's begging him to avert the evil scheme of Haman the Agagite and his plot which he had devised against the Jews. Haman is saying, if it be possible to change the law, let's change it. And she's about to find out it's not possible to change the law. So what is God going to do to save Israel? What is God going to do to save Israel? Again, we see Esther approach the king without being summoned. And we see the king again hand out his scepter, put out his scepter to her to allow her to be there and not be killed. And she wants to avert the evil scheme, the law, the 13th day of the 12th month law that says the Jews are to be killed, destroyed, and annihilated. She wants to get out from under that law, and she's about to find out it cannot be done. It's a Persian law. They can't be revoked. We'll stop right there. Trust me, God wins. God wins. God always wins. God wins. Why does God let Satan get so close sometimes? I think possibly my own thought is just to show us, son, I always win. It doesn't matter how big the enemy is. It doesn't matter how grave the situation is. What I say goes. I always win, and I am in complete control of human history. It gives me confidence to live in the days in which we live, for sure. God always wins. Let's close in prayer.